I'd be very, very curious to see when the third movie comes out, someone to make a fan edit that turns them into just an adaptation of The Hobbit. And it's like 2 hours long at most. I would love to see that.
It's entirely possible, I guess.
It's the exact opposite reaction I had to the Lord of the Rings movies, where when I heard about the extended cuts, like when that was first coming out, I was like, oh, I want to see more of this. With these, the Hobbit movies, I want to see less of them.
I really like the idea of fan edits, that just by changing around some scenes, you can change bad media into good media, like a magic trick. So when I found out about the Tolkien edit, which cuts the Hobbit trilogy down to only what's in the source material, I thought, yeah, that should fix everything. I was disappointed, because it just didn't fix the problems. I watched it as part of a Lord of the Rings marathon, and even though all the extra stuff had been cut, it still wasn't in the same league. Fundamentally, it fails to capture the same spirit as the Lord of the Rings. You can't fix a movie by editing stuff out when the real problem is what's missing in the first place. And this is how I felt about every edit that supposedly fixes bad media. Apparently, people have edited the final Game of Thrones season to be better. And maybe they make it better, but they can't fix it because what's missing is a satisfying conclusion. And you can't contrive a satisfying conclusion just by cutting and moving around the limited substandard content. It's not like you can cut out a few cringy scenes and suddenly Jon's character arc is paid off. The scenes necessary to give the show a satisfying conclusion simply don't exist. Have you seen that video? How Star Wars was saved in the edit? Turns out it's mostly complete nonsense. There's a detailed explanation providing actual sources to show this claim is only made by misrepresenting the condition of the film prior to the editing phase.
This page, presented in Rocket Jump's video, is from the third draft for Star Wars, dated August 1st, 1975. The shooting script for Star Wars was the revised fourth draft, dated March 15th, 1976. Now, I get it. I understand why Professor Jump presented the story about the crawl the way he did, and why he withheld nearly everything. It makes much more of an impact on the audience if you simply compare the third draft version of the crawl to the final. The difference in the word count between the two is 83 words, whereas the word count difference between the shooting script and the film version is only 32 words. And if you compare the content, it's mostly the same. But the video isn't called How Star Wars Was Arguably Improved Slightly in the Edit. It's called How Star Wars Was Saved in the Edit. And so far, I don't see a lot of saving going on.
I'd recommend watching the whole video because it establishes my main point. Star Wars wasn't saved in the edit, because basically nothing is saved in the edit. Nothing can be saved in the edit. Editing is a vital part of making a film, but so are lots of other aspects, and no one process can save a whole film. I can certainly confirm the Hobbit trilogy wasn't saved in the edit because I've seen the edit. It still has nearly all the same problems. A scene-to-scene comparison between a bad film and a good film should make it pretty obvious you can't just move some scenes around and turn a bad film into a good film. In this video, I'm taking it for granted The Hobbit is bad. Many YouTubers have made that argument extensively in other videos. The over-reliance on special effects that will then rush and appear noticeably cheap and artificial, the inclusion of juvenile humour, the cartoonish physics and thus largely tensionless action, these aspects hold the films back whether you're watching the extended DVD cut or any edit derived from it. Since everyone already knows this, I don't see the point in repeating it, but I do see the point in countering what a lot of people have said, or at least heavily implied, that the real reason the Hobbit trilogy is bad is because it's too long. So I decided to do some research, take every scene from The Hobbit and consider whether it would have any place in a good adaptation, or if it should have been cut. Spoiler alert, I am going to conclude some of these scenes should have been cut, just in case you're wondering. Also, spoiler alert for the Hobbit trilogy, if anyone still needs to hear that after I just said I'm going to break it down scene by scene. But this graphic on screen now represents the length of every scene, and I'll highlight the scene I'm talking about so you can see how long they are. Sometimes I'll explicitly mention that too. And this is to illustrate that even the scenes that should be cut aren't a huge proportion of the overall runtime. For now, I'm going to focus on the first two films and start off, of course, with An Unexpected Journey. Scene 1 is literally just logos, something for CinemaSins to complain about, but obviously not an actual issue. Next is Bilbo writing an account of his adventures for the benefit of Frodo. This scene is just a very brief framing device, and I think it works very well as one. The next scene showing the backstory for Erebor and Smaug is quite long, and it certainly could have been cut down and this information communicated elsewhere, but there's no reason it needs to be cut. The action is entertaining and it actually shows us the Lost Kingdom the trilogy is centered around. Also, at 6.5 minutes, it's still only half as long as the prologue to the Fellowship of the Ring. Then Bilbo talks to Frodo for about 4 minutes, and this is the first scene that absolutely could have been cut, cut, it's blatant fan service that achieves nothing. Also, without this scene, they could have done a transition from the smoke of the dragon's fire to the smoke from Bilbo's pipe as he sits on his porch. Gandalf shows up for a completely necessary scene, and next we have two really long scenes that are sort of just one scene, but I've divided them into the first 8 minutes and 52 seconds where all the dwarves slowly show up and the feast begins. I think everything here is worth including. I imagine this is also where people who haven't read the books would assume it's been added to, but it really hasn't. The Blunt the Knife song is from the book, and then Thorin shows up and we get a more elaborate explanation of the plan while exploring Bilbo's reluctance to join them. This is 13 minutes and 18 seconds, and again, none of it really ought to be cut in my view. By building up Bilbo deciding to go, it makes that decision more impactful, as does the next scene where we further establish his character to contrast with the growing he'll do throughout the story.
Stop! We have to turn around.
What on earth is the matter?
I've forgotten my handkerchief.
And now we've only just left the Shire after 45 minutes, and apart from a few minutes early on, I don't think any of it was unnecessary, and the slow methodical pacing actually added to the film. Next scene we get some more backstory about Thorin.
There is one who I could follow. There is one I could call king.
Please note, there are 13 dwarves here, so adding in smaller character moments where we understand the relationship between them does a lot to improve these films. Now after this we get a scene with Radagast. This stuff is obviously tacked on, but it's not exactly unnecessary. The purpose of this scene is to establish that there's a growing darkness in Mirkwood, which will come into play later. The troll scene is much longer, and that's obviously necessary, as is the scene of them discovering the troll's cave and Bilbo finding Sting. Radagast then intercepts Gandalf and explains his concerns about the rise of the necromancer to him. I think this scene could have been moved to later on in Rivendell when the White Council discusses the issue, especially since the whole orc rabbit sled chase scene is very stupid and absolutely should have been cut. This was 5.5 minutes long, overall still under 10 minutes of content to cut. After this the dwarves hang out at Rivendell, then the main orc antagonist is introduced. I think establishing a specific orc antagonist is a good idea, so this scene works well. Also, I'm not against adding in an orc confrontation at some point, because let's not forget the warg attack in the Two Towers was an addition not found in the books, and that worked really well. Then we have the White Council meeting in Rivendell. Here we find out Gandalf wants to help Thorin's company because he doesn't want a dragon to be in play while Sauron might be re-emerging. Definitely important information to be aware of. After this, Bilbo and the dwarves leave Rivendell.
I found it is the small things, everyday deeds of ordinary folk that keeps the darkness at bay. Simple acts of kindness and love.
Then there's the stone giant scene, which is from the books and does establish some character relationship, like that Thorin thinks Bilbo is dead weight and not that helpful. And then after this there's a great scene where Bilbo has a one-on-one conversation with a dwarf about wanting to leave. Again, absolutely essential to have these small character moments. And then we enter the final big moment of the film. There's a 5-minute 16-second scene where the dwarves are taken before the Goblin King, and then a 13.5-minute scene where Bilbo and Gollum play riddles. This is probably the best example of why length isn't the main problem with these films, because this scene really takes its time and it's generally considered the best moment of the whole film. By contrast, a lot of the worst scenes are really fast paced, so how can the issue be that the film's trying to be too long? Like the big fight the dwarves have with the goblins is only 7 minutes and 11 seconds, and that's intercut with Bilbo escaping Gollum, so despite the scene feeling really bloated, it doesn't even take up much time. Then they reunite after escaping the mountain.
See, that's where I belong. That's home. And that's why I came back, because you don't have one.
And we close with a 10-minute and 45-second action scene where the orcs show up and they fight. Obviously this is necessary, got to end your movie with a big climax, and we see this in the books. The eagles fly them to safety and Thorin shows an appreciation for the value Bilbo brings to the team.
Did I not say that you would be a burden? That you had no place amongst us? I have never been so wrong in all my life.
Then there's a surprisingly short 10-minute credit sequence. I swear, the credits for the Lord of the Rings films were like half an hour. And that's the whole film, so just 10 minutes of stuff that absolutely should have been cut, maybe 20 something if you really don't like the Radagast scenes, but the overall film is 2 3/4 hours, so even if you cut aggressively, this would still be on the longer side. To be honest, overall, I like this film. There's enough in it to enjoy that I give it a low 7 out of 10, and sure, obviously I don't like the unnecessary scenes, but if you cut those scenes out, maybe I'd change my rating to a middling 7. It's not like the extra length fundamentally ruins it. Indeed, the main reason I like this film is the half an hour they spend just hanging out in the Shire, so I'm perfectly happy it took its time. Let's move on to the Desolation of Smaug, of which I have a significantly lower assessment overall. Obviously, after the logos we have the prologue, which is unfortunately completely unnecessary. It's just Gandalf liaising with Thorin and only establishes information we already knew. 6 minutes and 28 wasted seconds right at the start. After this, the dwarves run to Bjorn's house, the orcs talk amongst themselves for 3 minutes and 39 seconds, and then everyone has a conversation with Bjorn in his human form. You could cut the orcs talking to each other, but they are a threat, so it's not exactly wasting time to re-establish their goals for this film. Then, just to blast through the next few scenes, they arrive at Mirkwood, have to cross a haunted stream, Bilbo has to rescue the dwarves from spiders, and they meet the elves and are taken captive. These 4 scenes are all necessary in my view and don't contain any unnecessary material, and they take up 23 minutes and 23 seconds in total. Now though, things get a bit complicated because from this moment on we bounce back and forth between various narratives, and to be honest, I stopped taking a note every time the scene changed because sometimes it would intercut every minute or two. But in Mirkwood there are 3 scenes that are absolutely necessary. Thranduil talks to the dwarves and decides to keep them imprisoned, Bilbo uses the ring to rescue the dwarves, and then there's the barrel scene. Actually, the barrel scene, which takes up 6 minutes and 55 seconds, probably could have been cut down as it has a lot of unnecessary action, although at the same time this again touches on the interesting point that sometimes the scenes in these movies that feel the most bloated aren't actually that long. Like if you've seen the barrel scene, I'm sure like me you thought it lasted at least 10 minutes because it seems to go on forever. The real issue isn't the unnecessary length of these scenes, but more issues like do they have stupid over-the-top acrobatics that defy all logic and remove any sense of tension. The barrel scene could have been just as long with only a handful of obstacles properly paced out, but that's not what we got. Anyway, to backtrack, there are 2 other scenes in Mirkwood, which both feature Tauriel and her relationship with Killy. The first of these is the shortest scene I've noted down at only 37 seconds, but the other one is 4 minutes and 47 seconds. I don't like this tacked on romance, nor do I like the inclusion of Legolas, but the main reason for that is there's already 13 dwarves who need characterization. I don't know why you'd add in these extra characters to take up screen time. So I'm not saying having a scene like this is unnecessary, but it should be focused on characterizing the dwarves. Like maybe Killy flirts with a nameless female elf to establish he's a bit horny, but we don't need a whole romance subplot. Anyway, after all this, we pick up Gandalf's plot where he's investigating Dol Guldur. I consider this subplot a perfectly welcome addition. Gandalf is constantly randomly leaving the hobbits in the book, so it's actually better if we see what he's doing. If you're interested, all the scenes I identified pertaining to this necromancer subplot are highlighted on the screen now, and in total they contribute 15 minutes and 45 seconds. But like I say, it's not wasted time because Sauron coming to power is actually a big deal, and I don't think it takes away from Bilbo's plot when it's perfectly fine for films to have an A plot and a B plot. Also, while I'm wrapping up the other scenes, Thranduil talks to Legolas and Tauriel and Legolas agree to pursue the dwarves. These scenes should be cut and they take up 5 minutes 38 seconds in total. So with that out of the way, we then have the dwarves meeting Bard and negotiating to cross the lake. Then they cross the lake, and when they enter we meet this guy called Alfred, who is a corrupt bureaucrat. This is actually a 4 minute and 45 second scene establishing that Lake Town has corrupt politics. Not strictly necessary, but it does add some intrigue, and I think Stephen Fry is very entertaining in this role. After this we find out Bard's backstory and how he has a specific reason why he would need to be the one to take out Smaug. This is a bit cliche compared to him just being a random decent guy, but it's not a bad scene in my view. Then eventually the people of Lake Town work out what's going on with Thorin's quest, and they decide to endorse his effort to retake the mountain with the hope it will bring prosperity back to the town. There's a scene that establishes Killy is sick and takes up 3 minutes and 11 seconds, but really Killy being on the verge of death is something they keep cutting back to, so I can't say how long it really lasts. Fortunately, I think this was a good change to include. Having some of the dwarves stay behind in Lake Town helps to keep the characters a bit more distinct, instead of 13 dwarves with very similar names all being crammed together and making it hard to discern between them. I don't think Tauriel is a good addition, but a plot about some of the dwarves looking for some medicine for Killy would be a nice way to give the characters something to do. The main company then head to the mountain and are able to open the door. There are then several scenes of Bilbo stealing from Smaug, intercut with other events. All told, there's 18 minutes and 44 seconds, and most of that is Bilbo talking to Smaug. They talk for a while, and again, this is the type of padding I can really get behind. It's not pointless, obnoxious action, it's actually building a sense of tension and demonstrating Smaug's character. I'm perfectly happy for the film to really take its time with Bilbo speaking to Smaug, and I'm glad it does. What's a bit more contentious is the orcs attacking Bard's house. Obviously this is a scene for Legolas and Tauriel, and therefore I don't think it's necessary. I could maybe try to justify the idea that some dwarves might stay behind and this would be the threat they face, but let's just say this 3 minutes 52 seconds scene could be cut. Then after this, the dwarves enter the mountain too, and Smaug starts to get more suspicious. I like this moment as it builds tension, but we then eventually progress to the huge, action-packed climax with the dragon. This scene takes up 15 minutes and 22 seconds, and basically, all of it should have been cut in my view, except for Smaug deciding to attack Lake Town. It should have just been Bilbo talks to Smaug, then Smaug gets angry, maybe the dwarves rush in to help him, there's a very brief chase scene where they escape, and once Smaug realizes he won't be able to get them, he decides to attack Lake Town instead. After this are the credits, which again, just over 10 minutes. Now sure, here there is more stuff I would want to cut out. I'd probably rate this film more like a high 5 out of 10, but that's not just because there's too many unnecessary scenes. If you cut all those scenes out, I'd still be upset because you'd cut out a lot of the character development for the dwarves. In reality, my problem with these films are just as much to do with what's missing as what's there. Because, here's the real hot take, they could have actually added more to them, making them better. Like, let's start with the thing I've already said several times now. There should have been more character moments for the dwarves. I mean, only a handful of them actually get to give any impression at all of who they are. So if you wanted to make the films this long, why not start off by really getting to grips with who these characters are, and giving us scenes to get potentially as attached to these dwarves as we were to the Fellowship. And then any time there's an opportunity for a conversation, maybe have the characters argue a bit or talk things through, and we can say, that's a classic buffer line, good old Gloin's at it again, in comes Bimbo with another zinger. One example that sticks out to me in this regard is where they cross the enchanted stream in Mirkwood. In the film, this scene isn't even 5 minutes long. Thing is, in the book, it's more of an ordeal. They have to throw a rope across attached to a bow. In the film, they just walk along some vines, and if anything, they're in too much of a hurry to get across. Why not a scene where they assess the situation and there isn't an obvious solution? A few dwarves make their opinions known, and eventually they work out how to get across by working together. So there we go, in this one scene it would actually be more faithful to the books and an improvement in terms of character development if you made it a little longer. I've also repeatedly stressed that often the fast-paced over-the-top action in these films doesn't actually take up that much time, despite how mentally draining it feels when you're watching it. The action scenes in the Misty Mountains in the Fellowship of the Ring actually take up more time than the Misty Mountains action scenes in The Hobbit. Why? Because they build up tension. Compare the Watcher in the Water scene to the Stone Giants one. In The Hobbit, we just cut to the middle of the giants already fighting. In the Fellowship, there's a slow build-up in tension as they realise something's going on with the water, and then just when they're about to escape, the creature jumps out and attacks Frodo. Why not have a scene of the dwarves climbing the mountains when suddenly they feel movement? They realise something's wrong, and slowly the mountains start coming to life in the form of stone giants. We see them running through various mountain passes, avoiding tumbling boulders, and eventually they climb up to the cave, and we can have the same scene we had in the actual film, but with a lot more excitement beforehand. And then ditto for the goblin fight scene, which is shorter and less entertaining than the one in Moria. Also, in the books, there's a moment where the goblins slowly stalk the dwarves through the cave, so why not include that in the movie? It would take more time while actually increasing the tension instead of just blasting through a load of ridiculous action set pieces. And finally, I need to go right back to the beginning and talk about where there could definitely have been some welcome additions. The Shire. Yes, I want more of the Shire. Because who doesn't want more of the Shire? I remember seeing this meme that was like, hey, remember when you were a kid and you found the Shire really boring? No. Can't relate to that at all. I always considered the Shire to be my favourite part of Tolkien's universe. But here's one thing we've never actually seen. A day in the life of the Shire. So if I was in charge of The Hobbit, here's what I'd do. After Bilbo has his conversation with Gandalf, we cut to the next day. We see him wake up, get dressed, have breakfast, water the garden, go into the market and buy some goods. We see him cook his meals. We see him reading in his study and writing letters. We see what an actual full day in the Shire looks like for a Baggins. Why? Well, firstly, because it would be awesome. People fly for hours to go to New Zealand just to visit Hobbiton. Why not actually have a portion of your movie showing what it would be like to actually live there in universe? Also, it would establish the contrast between the life Bilbo is living at the moment and the life we're going to see him living when he goes off on his adventure. Ever heard of show don't tell? Why just have him tell us he doesn't like to go on adventures when you could show us how peaceful and sedentary his life ordinarily is? And of course, it would add substantially to the runtime of the film. Him going about his day and having little conversations would really add up, until maybe he's at the shops buying some food and someone's like, "Oh, Mr. Baggins, are you expecting visitors today?" And he's like, "No, just stocking up the pantry. I'm not expecting any visitors today." And then we cut to him in his house that evening and all the dwarves show up. The point of all this is to say that you could actually pad out the runtime of The Hobbit and improve it as a film. So it's not that The Hobbit is too long and that's why it's bad, it's that the trilogy doesn't make the best out of the time it adds. Instead of showing us things we actually want to see, it shows us rabbit sledding and barrel bouncing. Now, there is one sense in which this whole video was a lie. There is one sense in which, yes, the length does ruin this trilogy. See, the reason why I didn't talk about the third film in the breakdown is because, admittedly, most of the third film is pointless and bloated. There's really no saving it. There's way too little plot spread way too thin, and even still, it's shorter than the other two films, which isn't great. The final film in a trilogy should be the big epic climax, not the shortest of the three films. A trilogy just doesn't work structurally. Potentially you could, considering everything I've just said could be added, equal the overall runtime of the trilogy, but dividing the story neatly into thirds would be a challenge. Even as it is, the trilogy format is the entire reason why we have the totally unnecessary over-the-top action scene at the end of The Desolation of Smaug, because these films always end with big action scenes. You end up with a giant action scene with Smaug at the end of the second film, followed immediately by another giant scene with Smaug. At that point, it's pretty obvious the trilogy structure just isn't going to work. Structurally, this film can only be two parts of one singular story, the same way we have lots of franchises releasing films in two parts nowadays. Honestly, if I was in charge, I'd probably end the first film after the spider attack. I imagine once all the unnecessary stuff is cut, that would probably place the spider attack as a suitable midpoint. And it works well for the narrative. The first film ends with Thorin realizing Bilbo is a valuable asset, but Bilbo's big moment where he actually proves himself as a brave fighter is taking out these spiders. Maybe make the scene feel a bit more climactic, perhaps in some way tie it up with the necromancer, like imply it's the necromancer influencing the spiders to attack or something, and that way it could be concurrent with Gandalf investigating Dol Guldur. It also works with the Radagast scene early on, because that starts off introducing the growing darkness in Mirkwood, and in the end Bilbo could fight back the spiders and save the day, and Thorin could be like,
I've never been so wrong in all my life.
And then the next film could start off with them continuing their journey through the forest and getting caught by the elves. And sure, those two films would probably be shorter in total runtime than the three films we got, especially since these are more child-friendly films, so they probably shouldn't be absurdly long. But the point is, it's not that these films need to be short. It's not like The Hobbit was a fantastic franchise that did everything right, which just became bad because Peter Jackson added too much to them. They were films with much deeper flaws beyond simply being bloated. Or, to put it another way, The Hobbit trilogy isn't too long, it's just bad. Thanks for watching, click this video on screen now to appease the algorithm and help out my channel.